Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Peter Catapano. Welcome to the Stone Live. I'm an editor for the New York Times opinion section. The Stone is a forum for contemporary philosophers and other thinkers to discuss issues both timely and timeless. Here with me today is Simon Critchley, the Stone's moderator. Simon is also a philosopher who teaches at the New School for Social Research. And today we're going to discuss humor, how it might help us through the current crisis, how humor functions in difficult situations. Before we bring on Simon, I want to just let everybody listening know that we want to hear from you. So please submit questions at any time during the event using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And also note, this event is being recorded. So you should know that before you participate. And let's get started. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Peter.
So I'd like to start today's call, Can We Laugh Yet? With some good news and bad news.
What's that?
Like the old jokes. So first, the good news. Last week, we asked the British comedian Stuart Lee to join us on today's call, and he said yes.
That's so exciting. That's fantastic.
It was fantastic. For those who don't know, Stuart Lee is a very funny, highly literate British comedian, the star of a popular stand-up show called Content Provider, and the author of several books and a column in The Guardian. Really one of the few people writing genuinely funny columns at the moment.
I agree. That's brilliant. So what's the bad news?
Well, the bad news is that he wrote us back Friday to say no. So Stuart Lee will actually not be joining us. The Content Provider will not be providing content.
Boom.
So we're going to forge on. That leaves you and me and the indeterminate number of times readers listening in. I sort of feel like we're two characters in a Beckett play, maybe Vladimir and Estragon, waiting for a man who will never show up. We're waiting for Stuart Lee. So I'm going to rename the show Waiting for Stuart Lee, and let's proceed.
I feel like Lucky from Godot.
Lucky, okay.
Yeah, I'm feeling lucky.
So let's start with the obvious question. Is there any way in this bad situation, is there anything we can find funny in it?
Yes. Yes, there is. I mean, it's, whether it is actually, not that it's actually funny at all, but I think in terms of how people respond to the situation, certainly in my case, which is kind of why it's so disappointing that Stuart Lee's not here, but also, we have to build that into the act. That has to be his no show, has to become the show. So, this is how Stuart Lee did not show up for the show, which included him. And I wanted him in the show because the only book which has really made sense to me since lockdown was a book that I bought by him some months ago, but had not read, called How I Escaped My Certain Fate, which is an extraordinary book, which is just three long stand-up routines, but stand-up doesn't really describe what he's about, and then meditations on the nature of comedy, which are really quite brilliant. And it's and I found that that was the only thing I was able to read basically in the first weeks, and pretty much since. And it took me back to some interesting avenues which we could explore if you'd like.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you turned to a comedian, or rather the comedian was sort of the only person who could hold your attention in such a time.
A comedian that doesn't tell jokes, importantly.
Right. So more of a storyteller almost.
Yeah, who doesn't really tell stories.
Yeah.
who just kind of repeats things and plays. What Stuart Lee does so brilliantly is he just plays with time. He just takes you. He could do jokes. But he has this interesting he uses this image somewhere that comedy is 4/4. Comedy is like a, boom, 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 boom. And if the world were 4/4, that would be fine. It would mean that, I don't know, Iggy Pop would be president or something like that. But his comedy is not 4/4. His comedy is using 5/8/9/4 or 68-minute ambient loops, or and he plays with comic form in a way that he's not telling jokes. And in many ways, the best comedy for me, the comedy that helps me get through, is the comedy that does not really tell jokes. Jokes are kind of too easy.
Yeah.
But actually, comedy, humor is about something else, which we could get into.
So just for our non-musical listeners, by 4/4 you mean 4/4 rhythm, which is
4/4 rhythm,
the rhythm of pop music, very straight ahead and expected.
And it's great. 4/4 is great. You can do a lot with 4/4, but you can't do everything with 4/4.
Yeah, you can dance to it. That's important.
You can dance to it, yeah.
Yeah. So anything stick with you from Stuart's book that you were sort of able to fold into what was going on around all of us right now?
Yes. I mean, the thing which really stuck with me was that he was talking about, how do we broach this? There was a very important documentary made by, was it Paul Provenza, some years ago, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, called The Aristocrats. And this really concerned one joke. And this one joke is a joke which begins with somebody going into a theatrical agent in New York, going to a theatrical agent, and have I got an act for you? Have I got an act for you? And they're a family act. And then so someone goes into a theatrical agent and says, I've got an act for you. Then the acts show up. Various things happen. And and those things are variously obscene. At the end of those various things happening, the agent turns to the act and says, well, that was really something. What do you call yourselves? We're called the Aristocrats. So that's the gag. You've got the premise, theatrical agent, and then you've got the punchline. It's not a particularly good gag. But then what comedians have done, this has been a comedian gag for many, many years, is they'll take that, the telling of that joke, and extend it to absurd lengths. Mm-hmm. Absurd lengths of more and more forms of usually obscenity involving incest and other kinds of nasty things like that. And so what that revealed to me, which was why I'm mentioning it, it was a kind of relief. It was a kind of, and Stuart Lee became a kind of champion of this film, and also tried to build this into his act. So I guess the punchline is that it's the singer, not the song. When it comes to comedy, it's the singer, not the song. Mm-hmm. It's not the gag. Anybody can tell, as the song is a joke, and anyone can do karaoke. But a real singer is something else. And so what we can appreciate in comedy is the art of telling the joke, and the art of telling something and letting that happen for 15, 20, 40 minutes. And in that, what looks like obscenity, straightforward obscenity, I think what we find is a kind of delight in the excessiveness of language. I think that's really important for where we are now. Mm. That the joke is a kind of can opener. It kind of opens things up. But what we find when we're watching a comedian that we trust, that we love, that we like, is there's a kind of excessiveness of language and being given permission to share in that delight. And at that point, we can relax. We can engage. We can switch off. We know things are going to be okay. And I think that's very important at this point, for someone to say this is all right. You still there?
Yeah, yeah. That was very enlightening. The question I think is probably on everyone's mind right now is whether you saw Brad Pitt open Saturday Night Live as Dr. Anthony Fauci last night. And
I did. Yeah, I saw a little clip. Yeah.
Yeah. I have seen various comedians performing their shows from their homes or wherever they are. And obviously there's an enormous silence there. that's kind of deafening. But I find, and I know it must be very difficult for comedians to work like that, and I've kind of found it very touching that they've been soldiering on like this without that kind of crucial element that exists in their live show.
Yeah, I mean, yes, touching, and also, amusing. I mean, watching these people without audiences is it's a little bit, voyeuristic, and so watching them kind of, not be able to play off an audience and not feed off that, and feeling how futile that is also kind of funny in some way,
Yeah,
in a kind of nasty, vengeful way, because it's very much, it reminds me of how I live my life, which is really, at home at a desk on my own, talking to myself, which is what I'm doing now. So
yeah, yes.
working without an audience is actually, it's, yeah, I'm not sure how much, but I thought the Brad Pitt, it was good.
Uh-huh.
And I think he's very good in his comic roles. I think
Yeah.
I've never quite got past his, when he played the gym instructor in Burn After Reading. I thought that was brilliant. I think Brad Pitt is a great comic actor,
Yeah. Yeah,
and therefore
I
when he's in
enjoyed it.
serious roles, it kind of goes on a bit, especially things like Ad Astra, which I had a hard time with.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing the listeners and readers might not know is that you actually wrote a book on humor
I did.
back in your early days. So you've thought a lot about this, and you've also written a book about tragedy
Mm,
very recently. So my question is has philosophy or history or any of the fancy education that you've had given you any insight on what's funny and what's not funny in a situation like this? The big thing we run into a lot is that uh, people will say humor is inappropriate,
yeah.
or it's not time for that yet. So what do you make all that, and what is that sort of? How does that come up in the idea of humor in the public sphere, like going back to the ancient Greeks or anywhere
Yeah.
along?
Well, I think firstly, I didn't have a fancy education. I went to the University of Essex in England, which at the time there were 42 universities in the UK, and Essex was consistently ranked 41st. So I went to one of the worst universities in the UK at the time. So I'm
Thank you
quite
for
proud of
clearing
that.
that up.
I
Good.
didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge or any of those fancy
Mm.
places. And then I would say that absurdity is a logical response to tragedy. And the idea of things being too soon or being offensive always mystifies me. I think it's too sentimental and too kind of moralistic a response. I think, you know, I think absurdity is a way in which we can make sense of a terrible situation. Um, and also, I think in relationship to philosophy, it would be, I mean, you could say that philosophy is like stand up, but without the laughs, and it goes on longer. And it's like stand up comedy, but without the comedy. And even you don't even have to do it stand up sometimes. So philosophy is basically sit down, non comedy. And that's how I understand what I'm
Yeah.
doing. And it seems to me that humor, as distinct from comedy, there's a difference. I mean, humor as a name for the jocular is something which arises in a specific language at a specific time. It arises in English at the end of the 17th century. And I've got a whole story to tell about that. So humor is what really interests me. And humor for me is the way in which we find ourselves ridiculous. It's the way in which we mock ourselves. So for me, the if you like, the essence of humor is ridicule and laughing at yourself, and that
Yeah.
is desperately important. So I find you know the the absurdity of the situation that we're in requires many things, but it requires a kind of humor. It requires a kind of jokes. It's that and also for me the humor is, this might sound a little bit odd because we think of jokes again in 4/4 time as ba 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 ba, or 1 2 3 4, and then that would be the laugh. And I think great comedy, great humor isn't really about the laugh. The laugh is what opens something up. And then a really interesting comedian will go into that area of laughter after the people have been cracked up, as it were, by the gag, and then move into something more compelling and more truthful. So I think, you know, the kind of discourse that I guess someone like Lenny Bruce invents in the 1960s, which is someone of great intelligence and with great material talking in a humorous way, but not just a humorous way. And that's what we call stand-up. That space is not a space which is just punctuated by laughter every 10 seconds or every 15 seconds. I think that's a very important point. It's not really about the gags. It's about the singer and not the song. And it's also about either when you're in the company of a great comedian or a comedian that you trust, you allow yourself to be taken somewhere and taken on a certain journey, given permission to laugh and think. And that, I think, philosophically is incredibly interesting and kind of rare experience.
Yeah. So I do want to talk a little bit about laughter.
Yeah.
You know, especially in a time like this, when there's so much suffering around. If you know you're not suffering yourself, you're very aware of what's going on out there.
Sure.
You know, so I haven't been laughing very much lately. It's sort of been a thing that I have scheduled into my life. At 9 o'clock every night, I pour myself a drink and sit down with my wife and daughter to binge watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Till we can't take it anymore, or it stops being funny, and then, you know, we go off to bed and sort of do it again the next day. But I was thinking about the kind of scheduled laughter. I think I've been using it to sort of as a way of forgetting things for a couple hours at night, but I wouldn't call it therapeutic. I hear a lot of people say comedy and laughter is important. It's a sort of a solace. But I see it sort of, you know, in this case as a sort of anesthetic. And I was wondering what it's been like for you. Like, what has made you laugh since this all began?
It's as people say, laughter is the best medicine, and of course it's not. Morphine is the best medicine, and it's so I'm not really persuaded by that either, that the idea of laughter as therapy or as you know, if it does that, fine, but in a way I don't really care. It's more that humor can be a way of opening up truth in a really, you know, important way, and that's of much greater importance to me. And the precondition for that, which goes back to philosophically, this goes back to something that Henri Bergson said. Bergson talked about comedy requiring an anesthesia of the heart, and I've always found that an interesting remark. And this is often what people get wrong, that there has to be, we have to suspend our usual moral reactions to things in order to laugh. So if somebody's walking down the road and they trip up and fall over on their face, we might run to help. But if that thing is comically framed, we know that this is a pratfall and it's an occasion for laughter. So we anesthetize the heart. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, there was this remark, I actually read this today, and it struck me as true. I was reading it today, that the stage of a stand-up club is like a giant pair of inverted commas. What is being said here is just being said, not done. It's just being said and not done, so judge accordingly. And there's an awful tendency to misjudge, you know, what is going on in humor, which is language being used in its wildest and strangest ways. And it might sound like that language is often offensive, and actually I don't think it is. I think something deeper is going on in comic language, something more, if you like, purely aesthetic. You know, there's a kind of sheer delight in aesthetic form that happens in jokes, a little bit like when, you know, when we're kids and we're just saying things to each other just for the sheer delight of saying them. There is something about that in humor which is really important, and it gives us time off, right? And it gives us time, off in a way we're anesthetized, there are big inverted commas around the stage, and also that we're being wrong-footed, and we like that. That I think a great comic is someone who's always wrong-footing the audience and keeping them off balance, and we enjoy that, being held off balance, and that's kind of the an exquisite pleasure of great comedy. I think all of those things together.
Very, very well said.
Thank you, sir.
So our friend Stuart Lee, I was reading through his Guardian columns. For those who don't know, the Guardian is a British newspaper, online news outlet.
The Manchester Guardian, as it used to be.
Yeah. So he was talking about the timing of jokes, not the literal timing as in 4/4, but this is what he said. The problem with trying to write supposedly funny columns during the crisis is the speed at which the news moves. Last week when I filed on Wednesday, our prime minister seemed fair game, but by publication day, he had tested positive and deserved sympathy. Do you buy that?
With Boris Johnson, it's a real stretch. I mean, particularly, I think the other thing with Johnson, which is, I don't know whether this is funny or tragic heroic, or or religious, because he gets the virus, things go badly wrong for him, and then he's admitted into the ICU. Clearly there's a struggle going on there. He's in real trouble. And and one more thing here is that within a country like Britain, the church has very little importance. Religion is, it's something that some people do, but it's of no real public consequence. But the National Health Service is the church that people believe in, and everything that the government is saying in Britain is about protect the NHS, protect the National Health Service, our nurses, our doctors, and so forth, and so on and so forth. And then Boris Johnson's admitted into St Thomas's Hospital, just opposite the Houses of Parliament, and then is resurrected like Christ out of the church, which is the National Health Service, on Easter Sunday. I don't know whether that's comic or what that is, but Johnson is a buffoon. He can do the lovable buffoon better than Trump, who is more vengeful. So yeah, obviously I feel sympathy for him. So yeah, the timing of things is an element, but it's hard to imagine that if we told jokes about Trump right now, they would not be appropriate in a week's time. I think.
Yeah, they'll have longevity. Okay, so we have a lot of listeners and readers on the line, and they've been submitting questions.
Wow.
Through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we have our wonderful colleagues sharing these questions with us. So I'm going to go down and read a couple of them. I'll direct them to you if I feel like I have anything enlightening to say about any of them.
You've always got something enlightening to say, Peter.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with Annette. Annette asks, didn't Freud argue that humor was really aggressive? If so, doesn't that mean that humor in this time works well in reducing anxiety? I guess the way you might, hit a punching bag when you were stressed out.
Yeah, that's a very good question from Annette, actually, because Freud writes a book on jokes that people don't read, and it's actually a fantastic collection of jokes. Freud just collected jokes, wrote them on cards, and then the book was published, I think, in 1905, and he didn't change it at all. Unlike the Interpretation of Dreams, which he kept fiddling with, and it's very hard to read. The joke book he left alone, and his jokes are related to the unconscious. They're related to unconscious aggression. True, and that's kind of his theory. So what's aggressive in gags has to be read in terms of what's repressed. So if I make a series of, say, I don't know, homophobic jokes over and over again, you know, over a series of years, you might begin to raise questions about my relationship to my sexuality. Maybe I'm repressing something, you know. So you have to read the gag negatively as a kind of, you know, concealed aggression. But he also says, this is the genius of Freud. In 1927, he writes this tiny essay called Humour. And he says in this essay, makes the following observation, which I find stunning. He says, imagine there's a man that's about to be hanged. And on the morning of his execution, he goes out into the courtyard where the gallows is set up, and he's walking out towards the gallows to be executed. He looks up at the sky and he says, "Well, the week's beginning nicely." In German, it's "Na, die Woche fängt gut an," he says in German. And Freud says, well, what's funny about that joke? And Freud's conclusion, 7 pages, is that when we're engaged in humor, we're looking at ourselves from outside of ourselves and we're finding ourselves ridiculous. And the humor consists in that. So this would be a function of humor that wouldn't just be unconscious aggression, which is how Freud thinks of jokes, but it would be a kind of self-observation in humor where we find ourselves ridiculous. And I think that's, again, really important right now, is that we have a tendency to, an understandable tendency to beat ourselves up, right? For what we've not done, how we've conspired with, you know, the events which have transpired, and how we should be doing more, and how we wish we hadn't led such useless lives, and not how we become doctors and nurses and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of bad superego telling us off. But there's also this possibility of us looking outside ourselves, finding ourselves ridiculous, and finding some relief in that. And I think that's kind of what we're looking for in comedy right now. Yeah. I think.
An anonymous user asks the following. There's been much commentary about sex in a shelter-in-place environment. The Times had a great article today about sexting. I think it was called "The Nude Selfie is Now High Art." Lots of people have read that this week.
Yeah, I've not read that.
Yeah. And there was a good article about solo sex a few weeks ago. What kind of sex humor has emerged, and how is some of the sex humor ethical or unethical, and or sexist / racist, etc.?
Well, the short answer to that is I don't know. Don't know. I think it's a good question, but I'd be interested to hear what other people have got to say about that. Maybe you too. I don't know. I think there's a kind of it's a weird situation, that's for sure. And it's I mean, I find, you know, having spent most of my life trying to bring about self-isolation, I finally have self-isolation. Yeah. So I'm quite well adapted to it, but it's it's tricky. What do you think?
I haven't heard much sex humor since this began. It's true.
No.
But obviously everybody's thinking about how sex has changed radically. It's been altered. I think the article that the reader was referring to, which was about a sort of a renaissance in people sending nude selfies to other people they felt warmly about as an act of connection in solitude, whereas, you know, a year ago it might have been, you know, a sort of offensive intrusion into your phone. You know, I think that
well, it's not been happening to me, that's all I'll say.
It has not been happening to me either, but apparently it's happening to some people.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a playfulness in that. And I think that that's, you know, there is some humor in that. And I think what the piece was sort of getting at was that there is this kind of playfulness and urge to connect with others.
Oh yeah, but you can say that, link that to, there's a kind of edgy meme culture, right? The edgy meme, that's which I've been getting lots of edgy memes, which are kind of pushing the limits of taste, which are usually sent on. I mean, who knows where they originate? It's like, where did jokes begin? Jokes kind of seem to arise like a virus in the world and then spread. But those memes that circulate and wash up on my phone, I mean, some of them are very good. Some of them are really pretty tasteless, actually. And like, I've looked at them and think, okay, here's a different circulation of stuff. That's interesting, but I don't know how, it's not consistently good, that's for sure.
Yeah. Pete asks, this is not me, another Pete, what's the most humorous thing you've heard or seen in the past week? A joke would help. Pete may be asking you to actually entertain him, but...
Oh, he wants to joke? Okay, I've got, I could tell Pete 7 jokes. Maybe I could do maybe even more than that, but here's some of my favorite jokes. I'll do them really fast. What'll I say? What'll I say? Tell them you're not here. Suppose they don't believe me. They'll believe you when you start talking. 2, do you believe in the life to come? Mine was always that. 3, have you lived in Blackpool all your life? Not yet. 4, do me a favor and close the window. It's cold outside. And if I close it, will that make it warm outside? 5, do you want to use a pen? I can't write. That's okay. There wasn't any ink in it anyway. 6, which of the following is the odd one out? Greed, envy, malice, anger, and kindness. Pause. And then the last one would be, I like this one a lot. What do Attila the Hun and Winnie the Pooh have in common?
What's that?
Same middle name. So silly jokes I like. Yeah, and I've got a joke about beekeepers, which, but it would involve me swearing. And I like that a lot.
Yeah. So
takes
maybe
about 3 minutes.
Yeah, we'll maybe we'll come back to that. This is actually, this is a great segue because you said you like silly jokes.
I do.
And Ross asks whether you can talk about British humor, particularly World War II or after World War II, the Goons, the Beatles, the Pythons.
Yeah.
I have a friend in Wales who I was talking to the other day who's really immersed himself into Spike Milligan.
Genius.
So yeah. So what do you think about the sort of British take on this?
It's yeah, there's a lot to say. I mean, there's a lot to say. I have a Welsh friend too, so it's okay. And some people do have Welsh friends, and it's
I have a few actually.
Well, no, my family's from Liverpool, so we're a bit, residually anti-Welsh. But
you're the same people, though.
Same people. We're the same people.
Yes.
But I mean, that's all absolutely true. And there is, there's a rich panoply of, British, Irish humor in those decades, which makes me deliriously happy. And I could talk about the Goons. I mean, Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, just in terms of comic timing, ability, acting ability, Peter Sellers, and so on and so forth. Early Python, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, who I worship, and then people that are known less here, like Dave Allen, the Irish comedian. The 1970s was very important, very static. And then the comedians that I really like best. There's a great film. There's a great film which I nearly watched last night in preparation for this this chat, which is a film called Funny Bones, which is by a director called Peter Chelson, made in the early 90s, and it stars an aging Jerry Lewis, which itself is interesting. The figure of the aging comic, and Jerry Lewis was obviously funny, and at a certain point in the film, the Jerry Lewis character's son wants to become a stand-up comic and keeps failing. And at a certain point in the film, the Jerry Lewis character explains to his son the following. He says, look, there's 3 types of people in the world. There are people who aren't funny. There are people that can talk funny. And I'm one of those. He says, I can get people to write gags for me, and I can tell them I can talk funny. And there are people who are funny, who have funny bones. And those are the really funny people with funny bones. And the comics which interest me are the comics who have funny bones. And often those comics, and in Britain, that would be characters like Frankie Howard, Les Dawson, Tommy Cooper, were people that couldn't actually do what they were meant to do. So Tommy Cooper was a magician that couldn't do magic tricks. Frankie Howard was a comic that couldn't tell jokes, and so on and so forth. So the comedy becomes the ineptitude of the act, but the person doing it is funny, and then you laugh. And so I wish there were more funny bones humor around. There's some, but there needs to be more.
Yeah.
The idea of humor as the idea of, I think what's the problem, I think, with a lot of American stand-up is that it's far too shouty. There's too much kind of shouting humor. And the idea that, every stand-up comedy is kind of, is a 1, 2, 3, is a 4, 4, kind of joke telling based on simple comedy and recognition. And you've got to keep the audience laughing relentlessly. And, if you think back to what someone like, Lenny Bruce or Richard Pryor were doing, it wasn't that. They were using the gags as a way of using their intelligence to tell the truth. And that's deeper and more interesting. And that's what it should be about.
Yeah, I always kind of think of that as in the way I think about jazz musicians.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Who respond in the moment. They use traditional forms and improvise on those forms, and every night is a little bit different. So I think that points back to the audience part. That's a part that's missing right now.
And that's what Stuart Lee's really good at, is to go back to our missing, the center who's missing. Stuart Lee is that he works with audiences in brilliant ways, and he'll divide them up, and he'll interrogate them and attack them and tell them to raise their game at various points, and again to try and keep them off balance, to keep them off balance so that you can wrong foot them. And it's that wrong footing which is kind of what, and also the other side of this, which I think is important, which is often lost in humor, is fear. That I think the comedian has to be someone you're scared of. That, and I think great comics are, a bit mad and terribly scary. And if they get too close to you, it's really, really worrying, right? So that I think the way a great comic uses the fear that they can project into an audience is also very, very important. Right?
Yeah, I know in New York that if you go to a comedy club or a performance, it's you never sit in the front row,
right?
Just because of that. So, well, speaking of Stuart again, and there's another comedian who comes up in the question sent in by Ken, and he sends in the following. Here is a test case. Ricky Gervais tells of a Holocaust survivor eventually growing old and dying and going to heaven, getting to meet God and asking permission to tell God a Holocaust joke.
Right.
God listens, but he's not amused by the joke. Oh, the Holocaust survivor says, I guess you had to be there.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
that is good. But why?
Yeah. God doesn't. I mean, God is not. I mean, it depends, which God you look at. But Jesus, Jesus doesn't laugh very much in the New Testament, and I mean, there are some funny things in there, but the water into wine. The thing about Ricky Gervais, which is fascinating, is that, I mean, going back to Stuart Lee, and Stuart wouldn't admit this, or wouldn't. He's written about it, but it wouldn't be the first thing on his mind. But Stuart Lee gave up stand-up in 2000 in kind of desperation. He just couldn't make it work. And then he went into writing theatre. There was a Jerry Springer musical that he was a co-writer on, and then he eventually found his way back to stand-up. But one of the things that did that, he went to see Ricky Gervais, who he'd not seen. He saw Ricky Gervais in a theatre in London, and Ricky Gervais was doing his act, basically. And Stuart Lee was sitting there thinking, that's my act. You know, this calm, insistent, this way of offering, you know, the way we associate now with Ricky Gervais of saying things which are contentious or offensive in a way that as if it's just kind of idle chatter, kind of throwaway thoughts. This was and the kind of the bone dry character of that is kind of what Stuart Lee developed. So, yeah, I'd love to ask him about that question.
Yeah. So we have a few more questions and a few more minutes. So anonymous, must be another anonymous. I appreciate and enjoy the British comedy, but fail to grasp the American. How would you articulate the differences? I think you got into that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it originates here. I mean, the great comedy is you know, and I grew up with, I mean, the thing that I can remember, there was a lot of comedy, and you know, we were expected to tell jokes growing up in my family. But the thing that I remember, I was about 12 or 13, was my dad allowed me to watch the Marx Brothers Duck Soup. And it was on late at night, maybe 10 or 11 at night. I was allowed to stay up and watch this. And I thought, this is absolutely wild, right? And this idea of, I mean, for me, that is, America is that. America is the Marx Brothers. It's that language in migration, people that were not, you know, from a family of native English speakers, you know, speaking Yiddish or whatever they were speaking. And they take that language, they develop these characters, these stereotypical characters like the stage Italian, Chico and the rest. And it becomes this kind of wild anarchic form. And so for me, you know, great comedy was American comedy. And that's what British comedy in many ways develops in the shadow of that and in awe of that, and then goes off in a different direction in the from the 80s onwards. And I think there's fantastic American comedy, and I think that it's not that different. So I think that what someone like, you know, Maria Bamford or Mitch Hedberg or people like that do is not, you know, it's not far from what Stuart Lee's up to. But there's a tendency to reduce stand-up to quick fire gags based upon some kind of assertive position that the comic is kind of in control. And I think a great comedian is also someone that is usually vulnerable, usually kind of exposed, raw. And I think that's what we could do is sing a bit more of in American comedy.
Yeah. When I was thinking about talking about all this today, I was remembering the scene in Hannah and her sisters when the Woody Allen character believes he's going to die and thinking about taking his own life, and he wanders in to see a Marx Brothers movie, and that sort of answered the sort of philosophical question for him. The utter ridiculousness of it just seemed to affirm life. So yeah, the Marx Brothers, they're still funny.
Oh yeah.
So I think let's do one more question. And it's a bit on the serious side. It goes back a little bit to what we were talking about before. From Julie, she asks, it would be great if you could speak about the positives and challenges in using humor as a coping mechanism, while also being sensitive to the seriousness of people being exposed who are essential workers, dealing with the loss of family members. How do we determine where these limits are in a really once in a century event?
Yeah, you know, in a way, to go back to the earlier gag, in a sense, you have to be there, right? There's that sense in which, if you look from what I understand about the comedy that circulates in medical schools and hospitals, it's fairly bleak, fairly melancholic, in the sense in which, you know, that we, humor is a coping mechanism and all the rest. And, you know, we can worry about, you know, whether in doing that we're being inappropriate. But I think we should look, you know, if you look at the kind of gags that circulate, again, in a medical context, the way people actually on the front line will survive by telling gags, which means that and this is a kind of the kind of awkward side of this, is there has to be a kind of depersonalization of this in order to get through. I was reading that piece in the New York Times Magazine last week by Helen Ouyang, on the sort of documenting her time in ER wards in the US, and I found that incredibly moving and tough, but also that she recognized that she had to shut down to save herself in order to continue with the work. And I think we have to respect that, but I think we also have to ease up on ourselves and not be too tough on ourselves at this point. And, we have to allow ourselves, give ourselves permission permission to delight in that kind of excessiveness of language and emotion that we associate with comedy, and just go there and spend the time we spend with it, and then we can turn our minds to more serious matters. But if we're kind of in that serious mode all the time, it's gonna be too much, I think, to bear.
Yeah.
Right.
I was actually writing with an editor, a friend of mine today, who's sort of expert humor editor, and I was asking him how he was navigating this, and he was saying basically that he felt a little hampered by the situation, but then he started to think about his own suffering, meaning he had lost somebody who was pretty close to him, and he felt like that gave him, it sort of gave him permission, like he had sort of paid some of the dues that were being paid, and he sort of used that to justify his venturing into humor. So that was one way that he was able to do that.
I mean, there is a coldness in comedy of necessity. There's a coldness. I mean, and it's the coldness which, in many ways, is a kind of philosophical coldness that, if we feel everything all the time about the situation that we're in, we're going to be overwhelmed. And that coldness both gives us a way of coping, and it gives us a way of viewing things, right? A way of looking at things coolly and analytically, and we need that some of the time. I mean, I don't think that, my basic view of humor is that humor is an antidepressant, right? It's an antidepressant, but it has the same structure as depression, same structure as melancholy. It's a kind of melancholic self-observation, but we get a relief with that. We get a kind of a lifting of that. So I think it's important to obviously retain our compassion and fellow feeling, but also not to lose it, because the other side of this is that there's a tendency to kind of wallow in kind of COVID porn a bit too much. And I found that a bit much, that, if I look at some of my friends on Facebook, it's as if they're finding the most extreme, article out there and then posting it as if this is some, marker of how serious they are. And I think that's maybe a bit too much at times.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we're addicted to our pain, and we don't need that. We don't need jeremiads all the time. We actually need sober news reporting, and that's what's in short supply, certainly in the broadcast media in the United States.
Yeah.
I find CNN a bit too much. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just kind of, it's so insistently sincere and moral. It's just exhausting watching it. You don't want that. I want to be told, well, what's happened, and what does it look like, and where are things happening, and how are things changing, and give that to me in an accessible form that I can understand, with some commentary on it. But don't pretend that you're a pastor or something.
Yeah. Well, Simon, I found this conversation uplifting today.
Good to talk to you as ever.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to speak, and I wanted to thank all the listeners and callers out there for joining us today.
We're going to be back next week, right?
I believe so, unless we get terminated.
Will there not a no-show?
We'll invite another guest, yeah. So this conversation is part of a slate of digital events that the Times is producing to help readers navigate the world we find ourselves in today. So I think we did that. I hope we did. Tomorrow, Monday, April 27th at 4 p.m. Eastern, you can hear from the Times San Francisco and Albany bureau chiefs as they discuss the difference between the California and the New York response to the virus. That should be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
To see all of the upcoming digital events, please visit the NY Time Live website, Times Events at nytimes.com. Okay, Simon, thank you and take care. And hopefully
Thanks a
we'll
lot,
be
Peter.
talking again next week.
Absolutely. Thanks a
Okay.
lot. Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.